Hello, I'm Mike and welcome to that bit of my channel where I chat about the physics degree. And this time my thoughts on student fees. So, to get you on the same page as me, a while back in time the UK moved from primarily funding degrees by government giving money to fund that course to some of that still happens, but a lot of the funding now comes from what are called student fees. So a student takes out a loan which pays the university to teach them, and then the student is expected to pay off some of that loan. Now, the UK, the way this works is the loan is written off after a certain amount of time. So as a student, you pay off some of that throughout your working life. And basically this is now how a lot of universities are funded. Loan means fees that go to the university, some of that will end up being paid by the student, and that's sort of backed up in some other way. I don't really know too much about the sort of murky details behind it, but the big difference is funded by fees from students rather than being funded primarily by grant. So, what are my thoughts on this? Now, I'm not sure about being too strong on my dislike for this, because obviously I'm in a very biased position. I'm in that debt, and it's fair to say that I have a massive incentive to be against things that put me in large amounts of debt for what I want to do. But that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, of course. It could be that I'm doing something that deserves to get me into a lot of debt. So, with that caveat, here's some of my thoughts about the effects of a student loan. Or not specifically the student loan, but more universities being funded by student fees predominantly. And the thing that I think is the question should be, how much power do you want students to have as a body? You see, the way I'd put it is this. When you're largely funded by student fees, the more you rely on student fees for your money, the more power students have if they drop out of the course or move to a different place. Because, of course, they move away, you don't get the fees. Now, how do you feel about large student loans? I think it really should in part depend on what you think about that as a thing. On the plus side, students have the power to demand things that are useful for them, but that universities might not be that inclined to give. So, like, trying to push for decent mental health support, for example, is something that's generally done by sort of student bodies. On the other hand, I do get the impression that subject choice is now being chosen less by what someone with experience wants to fund. If you're funded by a government grant, then obviously you've got to convince someone from the government. And I don't know the exact sort of dark secrets of how that was done, but I'm assuming the person you have to convince to run your course is slightly more experienced and sensible than the average 18-year-old. But beyond a 17-year-old, when someone is choosing what course they want to take. It's also worth pointing out that if you are financially worried about students dropping out of a course or moving, then this also means they have the power to get annoyed politically in a way that imagine if, sort of, say, someone comes to speak at the university and a whole load of students just storm out. We're going to a different place that doesn't invite arseholes like this, they say. Now, if you're relying on government grant for the money, you can just say, up yours. If a dozen students storming out, think of that at $9 and a bit grand a year. That's about 200 grand. 200 grand storming away. You can see why I think that there's a connection between high student fees being in the form of university funding and students having the power to do things like that. And whether you sort of want these student loans should, I think, in part depend on how you feel about that sort of action. I think the other thing as well is, if you don't want students to leave your degree, you also don't want them to drop out. And I think there's definitely in physics a lot less people who are now basically scraping on with the bare minimum of a physics degree at the end, when perhaps in the past they would have just been kicked off the course. Either that, or they sort of, rather than being completely kicked off of university, they drop down to a slightly lower ranking one and a slightly lower ranking one and eventually finish university. Whereas perhaps if universities weren't so in need of student fees, they might have been booted. So that's a few thoughts, I think. I'm not too happy with high student fees. I'm not entirely keen on students having such power to shape the courses they want. I mean, thankfully in physics, the sort of getting annoyed politically thing doesn't tend to happen, because it's physics, there's not a lot you can do there. But I certainly noticed the idea that it is becoming harder to kick off the sort of people who genuinely I don't think can be bothered, and who are just sort of scraping by. Perhaps in the past they would have been off the course. But anyway, that's enough rambling. Hope you enjoyed. Goodbye.